The gavel didn't bang. That's what they get wrong in the movies. In the movies, the judge strikes the wood like he's trying to break the table, a final thunderous punctuation mark to end the sentence. But in the federal courthouse at Foley Square, on that gray, suffocating afternoon in 1952, there was no thunder. There was just a soft, dull thud, a sound like a heavy book closing in a library. The air in the courtroom was stale. It smelled of floor wax, wet wool, and the nervous sweat of men who knew their lives were being measured in years. The man standing at the defense table didn't flinch. He didn't look back at the gallery, though he could feel the eyes of half of Harlem burning into the back of his neck. He didn't look at the prosecutor, who was already stacking his papers with the smug efficiency of a butcher wiping down his counter. He looked straight ahead, at the flag, at the wood paneling, at the nothingness. 15 years. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. 15 years in a federal penitentiary. For a man of 46, living a life where the average retirement age was death by gunshot, 15 years wasn't a sentence, it was a burial. He could feel the silence stretching out. The court reporter stopped typing. The stenographer's fingers hovered. For a moment, the entire machinery of the United States government seemed to pause, waiting for him to break, waiting for the outburst, waiting for the king of Harlem to beg or scream or curse. But Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did none of those things. He adjusted his cuffs. He smoothed the front of his double-breasted suit. He stood there with a terrifying, unnatural stillness. Inside, his mind wasn't racing. It had stopped. It was focused on the sound of his own breathing, slow and steady, defying the panic that was clawing at his throat. He knew that if he showed fear now, if he let his shoulder slump even an inch, the legend would die before he even reached the cell. He turned slowly. He looked at the marshal approaching with the handcuffs. The metal glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights. The click of the ratchet as they tightened around his wrists was the loudest sound in the world. It was the sound of a door locking, a door that might never open again. If you're drawn to the untold power stories of Harlem and the men who ruled without noise, you're already in the right place. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The official records will tell you that this was a victory for law and order. They will tell you that the conspiracy charges stuck, that the drug trade was dealt a fatal blow, and that justice was blind. They will cite the statutes and the case numbers. They are lying. The files that were buried deep in the archives of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics tell a different story. They reveal that this wasn't about drugs, it wasn't about conspiracy, it was about erasure. The government didn't just want Bumpy Johnson in prison, they wanted him unmade. They wanted to take a man who had become a symbol of resistance and turn him into a number, a statistic, a cautionary tale. This story isn't about a trial, it's about a war fought in the shadows of the legal system, a war where the weapons were writs and motions, where the battlefield was a 6x8 cell, and where the stakes were not just freedom, but sanity. This story will change how you understand the law. It will show you that for men like Bumpy, the courtroom wasn't a place of justice, it was just another street corner, and the judge was just another rival boss with a bigger gang. But before you understand the legal warrior, you have to understand the prisoner. You have to feel the stripping away of the self. Imagine the transition. One day, you were the most powerful man in Harlem. You walk down 125th Street and traffic stops. People tip their hats. You decide who eats and who starves. You are a king in a kingdom you built with blood and intellect. The next day, you are nothing. The first night in the federal detention center, Bumpy lay on a cot that smelled of mildew and other men's despair. The suit was gone. The gold cufflinks were gone. He was wearing gray cotton that scratched his skin. The lights never really went out. There was always a hum, a buzz, the clanking of keys, the shouting of men losing their minds 3 cells down. He stared at the ceiling. For the first time in decades, he was vulnerable. He wasn't Bumpy here. He was inmate 1117. The guards didn't care about his reputation. In fact, they hated him for it. They wanted to see him break. They wanted to see the dictator scrubbing floors. He felt a cold, hard knot of fear in his stomach. Not fear of violence. He could handle violence. It was the fear of irrelevance, the fear that the world would keep spinning without him, that his lieutenants would carve up his territory, that his name would become a whisper, then a myth, then nothing. He realized, lying in that dark cell, that the physical walls weren't the real prison. The real prison was the feeling of helplessness. The legal system had designed it this way. It was a machine built to crush the ego, to grind a man down until he accepted that he was property of the state. But they had miscalculated. They thought they were locking up a thug. They didn't realize they were locking up a scholar. It started slowly. The introduction to his new reality wasn't marked by fights in the yard or stabbings in the shower. It was marked by observation. He was transferred to Alcatraz, the Rock, the end of the line. This was where they sent the incorrigibles, the men the system couldn't break. They put him there to isolate him, to cut him off from the lifeline of New York. When he arrived, the other inmates watched him. They expected him to stride in like he owned the place. They expected the gangster strut. Instead, they saw a man who moved with quiet precision. He didn't talk much. He didn't join the cliques. He didn't gamble in the yard. He watched. He watched the guards. He watched the rotation of the shifts. But mostly, he watched the library. While other men were lifting weights, trying to build armor for their bodies, Bumpy was building armor for his mind. He realized that the only way to fight a system built on rules was to understand the rules better than the people enforcing them. He began to request books, not novels, not magazines, law books. The warden laughed when he signed the request. "What's he gonna do?" the warden joked to his deputy. "Sue his way out of Alcatraz?" What he didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson possessed an IQ that rivaled the judges who sentenced him. He had a mind that saw patterns where others saw chaos. He began to read. He read the U.S. Code. He read case law. He read the Constitution until the words blurred and then sharpened again into weapons. The tension in the prison began to shift. It wasn't the tension of a riot brewing. It was the tension of a hierarchy being rearranged. Inmates started coming to him, not for protection from a shiv, but for protection from the parole board. "Bumpy, they denied my hearing. Bumpy, they say they lost my paperwork. Bumpy, is this legal?" And Bumpy would sit there, in the corner of the yard with the cold wind of the San Francisco Bay whipping around them, and he would explain. He would cite precedents. He would draft motions on scraps of paper. This is where everything changed. The guards started to get nervous. They realized that the man in cell block B wasn't just doing time, he was organizing. Not a gang, but a legal defense fund. Every month that passed was another escalation. The authorities tried to restrict his access to the library. They claimed the books were contraband. They moved him to isolation. But you cannot isolate an idea. Alone in the hole, in total darkness, Bumpy drafted arguments in his head. He memorized statutes. He realized that the legal system was just another racket. It had bosses, judges, soldiers, and a code of silence. And just like on the streets, if you found the loophole, if you found the leverage, you could flip the script. That decision would haunt the Bureau of Prisons forever. Bumpy decided he wasn't just going to fight for himself, he was going to clog their machine. He began filing lawsuits. He sued for better food. He sued for medical care. He sued on behalf of other inmates who couldn't read or write. He forced the warden to answer to federal judges. He forced prosecutors to drive out to the island and argue cases they thought were closed. He wasn't winning every case. In fact, he lost most of them. But that wasn't the point. The point was the friction. He was making it expensive to keep him. He was making it painful. He was showing them that even in chains, he had reach. The climax of this legal war wasn't a dramatic courtroom confession. It was a moment of quiet, crushing realization for the system. It happened during a hearing for his own transfer. Bumpy stood before a review board. These were men who viewed him as subhuman, as a criminal element to be managed. They asked him why he should be moved from Alcatraz. They expected him to plead hardship. They expected him to beg for mercy. Bumpy looked at them. He didn't beg. He began to speak. He dismantled their logic. He cited the specific regulations of the Federal Bureau of Prisons that they were violating by keeping him there. He pointed out the procedural errors in his original sentencing. He spoke with the diction of a Harvard professor and the cold confidence of a man holding a royal flush. The board members shifted in their seats. They looked at their papers, then at him. They realized with a creeping sense of dread that the inmate knew the law better than they did. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, he was simply stating facts. "You are holding me illegally," he said, his voice level. "And I will prove it, not with a gun, but with your own books." The silence in that room was different from the silence in the courtroom years ago. That first silence had been the silence of a victim. This was the silence of a predator who had just closed the trap. The twist was psychological and absolute. The system had tried to bury Bumpy Johnson to silence him. Instead, they had given him the one thing he needed most: time. Time to read, time to think, time to evolve. The climax of this legal war wasn't a dramatic courtroom confession. It was a moment of quiet, crushing realization for the system. It happened during a hearing for his own transfer. Bumpy stood before a review board. These were men who viewed him as subhuman, as a criminal element to be managed. They asked him why he should be moved from Alcatraz. They expected him to plead hardship. They expected him to beg for mercy. Bumpy looked at them. He didn't beg. He began to speak. He dismantled their logic. He cited the specific regulations of the Federal Bureau of Prisons that they were violating by keeping him there. He pointed out the procedural errors in his original sentencing. He spoke with the diction of a Harvard professor and the cold confidence of a man holding a royal flush. The board members shifted in their seats. They looked at their papers, then at him. They realized with a creeping sense of dread that the inmate knew the law better than they did. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't threatening, he was simply stating facts. "You are holding me illegally," he said, his voice level. "And I will prove it, not with a gun, but with your own books." The silence in that room was different from the silence in the courtroom years ago. That first silence had been the silence of a victim. This was the silence of a predator who had just closed the trap. The twist was psychological and absolute. The system had tried to bury Bumpy Johnson to silence him. Instead, they had given him the one thing he needed most: time. Time to read, time to think, time to evolve. They had sent a gangster to prison. They were about to release a philosopher king. The stories didn't talk about Bumpy stabbing someone in the showers. They talked about how Bumpy made a federal judge apologize. They talked about how Bumpy got a guard fired with a piece of paper. He turned the event of his incarceration into a legend. When he was finally released, when he walked out of the gates in 1963, he didn't look like a broken old man. He looked like a man who had just graduated. The enemies who had hoped he would die inside were now terrified, because the Bumpy who returned was more dangerous than the one who left. The Bumpy who left knew how to break legs. The Bumpy who returned knew how to break cases. He walked back into Harlem not with a vengeance, but with a terrifying calmness. He knew the streets had changed. He knew the game had changed, but he also knew that the fundamental rule of power remained the same. Knowledge is the only weapon they can't confiscate at the door. The young Turks, the new dealers, they looked at him with skepticism. They saw an old man. They didn't know that inside that old man's head was a library of warfare strategies, both legal and lethal. He spent his final years not just ruling, but teaching. He taught the younger generation that a gun is a liability, but a loophole is an asset. He showed them that true control isn't about being the loudest voice, but about being the one who wrote the rules. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's greatest battle wasn't fought with a knife or a gun. It was fought with a writ of habeas corpus. It was a battle for the sovereignty of his own mind. Power, he realized, is not given, it is not taken, it is defined. The law tries to define you as a criminal. Society tries to define you as a monster. But if you have the patience to sit in the dark and the foresight to read the fine print, you can define yourself. He proved that you can lock a man in a cage, you can surround him with stone and cold water, you can strip him of his name and his clothes, but if that man decides he is free, if he refuses to accept the definition the world has placed upon him, then there is no prison in the world that can hold him. The gavel can bang, the cell door can slam, but the mind has no walls. This is Bumpy Johnson Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.